really moved to help set the stage for this conversation between John Wood Jr. and Dr. John Powell, where they will bridge across one of the biggest and hardest gaps our society is grappling with, where so much breaking is happening in communities and families. They'll be having a bridging conversation across ideological lines. After years of supporting and investing in progressive organizers and advocates on issues of racial justice and equity, I decided to bridge a gap myself. I took on the role of leading New Pluralist Collaborative in order to help build the field of pluralism with a powerful and divergent group of field builders, including John Powell and John Wood Jr., and a set of committed and diverse funders. Through this work, we are collectively balancing and navigating across many lines of difference: race and gender, urban, rural, faith, research to practice, and ideological perspectives. As I've built relationships with people and ideas very different from my own, I find myself uncomfortable a lot. As someone who's been deeply curious about people, who has worked in other cultures and so many different pockets and kinds of communities across the country, I've been alarmed by how flat my own narratives are about people I perceive are on the other side of the ideological spectrum. And as I've listened to people's stories, taken the time to understand why they've landed where they have, I've been equally surprised to find myself, liking people I never thought I'd like. I thought I could accept and tolerate people for their different views, but I found myself genuinely caring for people in a way that's hard to undo. And John Wood Jr. is one of those people. I've gotten to know him and his story. I see him as someone who moves in between worlds. He's biracial with one conservative parent, one progressive one. His career spans across fields and sectors. And while he's run as a Republican and his work with Braver Angels brings him into deep relationships with Trump supporters and people whose beliefs run counter to so many of my own, I now find it hard to flatten him. It's easy for me to consider John Powell as one of my own, but as I see him, a wise elder in this space, stretching his hand way out across lines of difference, in rooms and places where we aren't supposed to go, I have to pay attention. How does he navigate staying true to his own values, his own perspective on how the world could be, what change looks like, while also expanding his circle of concern well beyond that? As we enter into this conversation, I invite you to join me in stretching yourself, to try on the stories and ideas the two Johns explore together. I also invite you to try something else on with me. Whenever you hear your thoughts go, I agree or I disagree, pause just for a bit. It doesn't mean you eventually or ever have to agree with what you're hearing, but are we willing to truly consider what's being said? I'll start off the conversation, then hop off screen for these two brilliant folks to talk. Start us off with a question. So you are both busy people who work in different worlds. And John Wood Jr., you flew in from LA. Why are you here? Why are you taking the time to talk to each other? Why is this important to you?
Well, thank you very much, Uma, just for that wonderful and poignant introduction. John, it's a pleasure to be here with you.
It's great to be here.
Meeting you in person for the first time. The reason I'm here is because I think that democratic society is we're at a crossroads in our national and political existence today. It's not an entirely unfamiliar crossroads, but we have a choice as to whether or not we wish to pursue the future of American democracy in a way that centers the human dignity of people across the spectrum of experiences of American life and calls people in to be co-creators of a future that uplifts both our material prosperity, but also our social flourishing and connectedness. Or I think that we can pursue a politics of cynicism that is comfortable with reducing people to abstract caricatures of who it is that they really are, in the hopes that just by seizing power or the right sort of position in office, we can fix problems sort of through political force, but not through moral persuasion and through social connection. And I think that that is not the path towards the sort of America that I want to see. But if we're going to see a country that truly does embrace the notion of, what I might refer to, what Dr. King referred to as the beloved community, then we actually have to be able to model that in dialogue that is able to reach deeply into, one party's experience and join it in dialogue with another's. And so, the opportunity to talk to yourself, John, the opportunity to be able to share that conversation with the people who are watching, listening to us here, it seems to me like a vital example to be able to set in the work of traveling towards, that sort of a society of social and spiritual flourishing in democracy. So yeah, that's my answer to the question.
Great. Well, first of all, it's great to be here with you, John. And we are hosting, the Othering and Belonging Institute is hosting these 2 days plus. And I want to acknowledge just to have a fabulous staff. They're really great people to work with. We don't always agree, but we are always pulling in the same direction. And there's always a sense of family and caring and love. And the name of our institute, the Othering and Belonging Institute, I think says a lot. We think that the problems that we're facing in terms of what some people have referred to as toxic polarization, and it happens along many different axes, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, political party. And in some ways it's new. The level of toxicity, not just in the United States, but in the world, is pulling people apart at the very time that we have things like the internet and social media and the world getting smaller. And this earlier panel, there was a speaker named Pat, and she said, I said, why do this? And she said, if we're going to survive as a human species, we have to figure out a different way. We have to figure out a different way. The risk of not doing this is so big. And then, of course, the other thing, of course, which you've talked about and some of the stuff I've seen on your videos, just caring about people. Fundamentally, caring about people, and even beyond that, caring about life. How do we belong to each other? One of my favorite writers talks about everybody's struggling to belong, whether you're conservative, whether you're liberal, whether you're rural, whether you're urban, whether you're white, whether you're gay. Everybody wants to belong and needs to belong. Unfortunately, set it up that one person's belonging sometimes is another person's othering. And I think, to be candid, I really push my staff for this conversation. We talk about short bridges, which is bridges with people who you share many things with, but you have a disagreement. And one of my favorite examples of that, I'm a vegetarian, is that sometimes there's a tension between vegetarians and vegans. For a lot of people, they have that reaction, like, what's the difference, right? But people can use that difference, any difference, to turn it into a really serious fight, or in a family. And then there are medium bridges with someone, and then there are the very long bridges. And the fragmentation and the polarization that's happening today is not just personal, it's organized. We talked earlier about people being punished sometime if they decide to bridge. And people have probably heard me say that my friend Bell Hooks makes the observation that if you become a bridger, bridges are made to walk on, you're liable to be punished. And so I wanted us to have a conversation, especially toward the end of this incredible conference, with someone who, from an ideological perspective, a political perspective, I may not agree with, but I respect. And actually, because part of bridging is not about agreement. It's not about persuading you that I'm right or persuading me, but it's about us connecting at a human level. I oftentimes say that the mind wants to be right. The heart wants to connect. And so can we have a heart-centered conversation? I want to find out about you, who John Woods Jr. is. And turns out that's actually quite powerful, that when we engage in really seeing each other, the South African word sabawanu. It actually has an impact both on the person seeing, but also on the person doing the seeing.
Right.
But we can only really see each other if we're really curious about each other. We're willing to acknowledge our complexity, our multiplicity. And oftentimes when we do the opposite of bridging, polarize and break, we only see each other as caricatures.
Right.
So I'm hoping, to me, this is important for the conference. It's important for the thousands of people looking in. It's important for the world, but it's also a delight. So I'm looking forward to the next 40 minutes getting to know more about John Woods Jr., not just your political views, but who you are, what you care about. What are some of the things you've struggled with?
Indeed. Well, I'm honored to be here to play that role. And I can only affirm all of your reasons as to why that is, as to why that's important. So happy to jump in.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about yourself. I looked at some videos and I said to John before we started that I didn't want to, get too scripted. I don't want this to be rehearsed. I want it to be real and authentic. But I do know you're from a multiracial family. I do know you ran in LA as a Republican. I do know that the Reverend Dr. King has influenced your thinking in terms of beloved community, what we now call a belonging community.
Right.
But tell me about yourself.
Indeed. Well, so I spent a fair amount of time talking about myself in terms of my experience and sort of how that connects with the work that I do, and I'm still struggling to condense things a bit, but I'll do the best that I can. I grew up in a multicultural suburban Culver City, California, suburban city in Los Angeles. It's actually where most of the Hollywood recording studios are located, where most of the recording for Hollywood movies takes place. And I am the product of a family that, as you referenced, is biracial and also multicultural and bipartisan, really. When I was running for, some folks who follow me have heard me say this in the past, but when I was running for Congress, I had sort of a canned line, as politicians often do, that worked as a means of introduction, whether I was speaking to a liberal Black church in South Central Los Angeles or to a white Tea Party club in South Bay, LA County. People would ask me at the age of 26, what makes you qualified and capable of representing a district as diverse and complex as the California 43rd? And I would tell them, well, I come from an interesting family background. My mother's a liberal Black Democrat from inner city LA. My father's a conservative white Republican from Tennessee. I grew up explaining my father to my mother and my mother to my father. And that's why I can represent all of you. And it was always sort of good for a laugh and different audiences. It was a somewhat humorous way of revealing sort of a mixed cultural starting point in my case, wherein one of my earliest memories in life is hearing my parents, who were both headstrong personalities, who came together across vast chasms of difference, whose marriage did not last. One of my earliest memories in life is, hearing them, as they often did, shouting and screaming at each other, in the living room, having very audible fights, and on one occasion, the age of 4 or 5, me sort of running in the middle of them, standing in between them, putting my hands over my ears and screaming at them to stop screaming at each other. Somebody gave me cause to remember that a year or two back, and when I thought about that, I realized I've sort of been doing the same thing ever since. My upbringing was complicated. I had 3 basic environments, native environments, growing up. I would visit my mother's family in Inglewood and South Los Angeles, erstwhile South Central Los Angeles. Inner city areas, I would take the bus places with my young uncle. He was a year older than I was, more like a cousin or even a sibling. And we'd travel through Inglewood and South LA, and I got used to the reality that there are certain neighborhoods we didn't want to step foot in if we had the wrong color shoelaces on, because we might not come out the other end of them, that we wanted to be careful around the police, etc. Over holidays, I would visit my father's family. my grandparents, who lived in a multi-million-dollar home in La Jolla, California, coastal community. Their house was down the street from Mitt Romney's house, the one with the car elevator that they used to talk about in 2012. And but from day to day, I lived in multicultural, middle-class Culver City. The school district I went to was ranked as the 4th most diverse school district in America. And my friends growing up were Korean and Japanese, or Indian and Jewish, or white and black and Latino, and so I had this kind of panorama of environments that, for me was normal, and it was a while before I realized that was somewhat uncommon. So, I didn't travel a lot geographically growing up, but socioeconomically, I was going around the world and back in some respects. I did not have a self-understood racial identification until I was about 7 years old. I remember when I was 5 years old, the reality of color differences always stood out to me, because even though I lived in a multicultural environment, and, in my family, actually, I've got cousins who are Brazilian, Belizean, and Mexican, and so forth. But in general, I noticed that, most families, everybody's the same color or something close to that. But in my household, there are 3 colors. My mother, who's darker skinned, my father, who's fairer skinned, and me and my brother, who are in between. And I remember asking my dad, it was 5 years old, he was making a sandwich in the kitchen. I came up to him, I said, Dad, I said, you're white, right? And he sort of stopped what he was doing and looked at me and said, yes, son. I said, Mom, she's black, right? And he said, yes. And I said, what does that make me? And he looked at me sort of, some bemusement. He said, well, can't you tell, son? I said, I don't know. And he took my hand and he held it up and he turned it to where I could see the back of my hand, see the color of it. And he said to me, you're tan. And I said, I'm tan? He said, you're tan. And so for the next 2 years of my life, John, my self-professed racial identification for anybody who would ask was tan. I took that as like the category until, somewhere along the way, somebody informed me that was not, in fact, a recognizable thing. But, it's just to say that in the environment in which I grew up, the idea of a post-racial America, such a naive notion to many people across the country, was actually the reality of my upbringing, which is not to say that the real cultural differences and class differences that exist between white and black, rich and poor, South and Southern and urban weren't all, in my family, and didn't all have a hand in sort of the unraveling, I think, of my family, or at least my parents' marriage and so forth, and in various ways. These things were all at play. But I grew up initially idolizing Martin Luther King Jr. because I believed that his vision, his work, made possible my very existence. My father's parents were people who would have been considered socially liberal Democrats by the standards of their time. They were from Tennessee. My father's father, who's a very important figure in my upbringing, was a very successful record industry executive. He owned Dot Records in the 1950s. And before that, he started the first radio show. He's a white man, but started the first radio show in America to broadcast rhythm and blues and gospel, basically black music to a national audience. He had a great esteem for black culture. That did not mean that there was comfort with interracial marriage. And, that was something that was internally sort of a scandalous, affair. My father married my mother, within our family. But by the time I was old enough to have any sort of relationship with my grandparents, they were long past that. They loved, me and my brother, I think, more than anything. And so, the America that I experienced early on was an America that seemed to have overcome, because in the context of my particular nest, if you will, and sort of the community I grew up in, it largely had. Now, one thing I was conscious of and became far more conscious of over time was the fact that there were clearly different types of certainly Black experiences. Somewhere along the way, I realized that there's some differences between the experience of myself and the sort of smaller percentage of Black kids I went to school with who grew up in the suburbs, who grew up middle class, who grew up sort of like I did, and the larger percentage of both Black and Latino kids who were bused in from South Central LA, who lived where my cousins lived, aunts, uncles, grandfathers. But when Barack Obama ran for president in 2008, I looked at him as embodying sort of this idea of a post-partisan, post-racial nation that built upon the vision and sacrifice of Dr. King, that in a sense sort of crowned my understanding of America as a nation that genuinely had overcome the prejudices of its past and needed now at that stage to build out in a spirit of agape love relationships between Republicans and Democrats who could no longer find common ground. I mean, like yourself, even then, I felt that the social fabric of the nation was very much at risk. And so when Obama ran for president, I took it upon myself, somebody who was inspired by his campaign, worked for him in 2008 at a low level, door to door. I took it upon myself to start studying conservatism, to start studying Republican politics and conservative beliefs in a way that would allow me to be a more effective communicator with conservatives and Republicans who I wanted to bring into the hope and change movement, in essence. And because for me, the idea of hope and change was about striving towards the beloved community. And I wanted to spread that gospel, so to speak. So now a number of things happened all at about the same time, which every part of this didn't have much directly to do with the other, but it all led me to a bit of a political conversion. I met a woman when I was working at a Democratic call center, telefundraising call center. Actually, we were calling for both the Democratic Party and the Heritage Foundation, but most of us were mad about having to call for Heritage. These call centers, they're sort of mercenary, you find out when you get into it. But I met a woman who was from a traditional Black Baptist background. I was a person who came of age with a deep suspicion of organized religion in general and Christianity in particular. And I had sort of embraced kind of a new age kind of philosophical perspective. But we would have these theology versus philosophy sorts of arguments. And I remember in retrospect saying something very condescending to her. I said, you're such a smart person. You're so intelligent. How can you believe in this book of fairy tales and superstitions and isms? If God is real, he can't be sexist and racist and so forth. God's got to be about love and higher vibrations and enlightenment and positive energy. And she responded to that by saying, that's right. For though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, if I have not love, I am as sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. If I have knowledge to understand all mysteries and faith to move mountains, if I have not love, I am nothing. If I give my body to be burned and my goods to feed the poor, if I have not love, it profits me nothing. And I listened to her say that, and I said, that's beautiful. I said, did you write that? And she said, no, fool, that's 1 Corinthians, right? And so I challenged myself to read the Bible from cover to cover, came out on the other side of it, regarding myself as a Christian, finding some deep spiritual truths in that made me think that Christianity had a place in American life and in the world in general that I didn't think it had before. And for me, that was a bit of I always associated religiosity much more with conservatism than liberalism. I sort of prided myself in being secular and having that be part of my identity as a liberal. And so I drew a harder line there than other folks maybe did. That woman would become my wife. We got married. She was not a political conservative, but comes from a more traditional vein of the Black experience. She joined the Army. We moved from Los Angeles to Colorado Springs, and suddenly we joined a faith-based community. It was actually a Messianic Jewish synagogue, interestingly enough. And for the first time in my life, all of my friends were religious people and soldiers. I was no longer in Los Angeles. I was in a military town, in comparison, strikingly more conservative. but I found deep relationships and deep value in the structure of religious practice and the structure of military life, the inculcation of certain disciplines and virtues and practices, all while I was, reading books I hadn't read before, Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand and Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, started thinking about the value of entrepreneurialism, my grandfather's own career as a businessman, the impact that he had. And I began studying African-American history from a more conservative vantage point, all on top of becoming a married person and a more religious person as well. And I just looked up one day and I went down a list of about 100 issues, political, cultural, and I asked myself where I fell sort of on the left-right spectrum of things. And I realized, to my great chagrin, to be honest, that I was about 22, 23 years old at this time, that I was right of center on 62 or 65 of them, at least. And that was discomforting, because so much of my identity had been built around the idea that I was a Democrat and a liberal and an activist and so forth. But for all that, I may have just chosen to be an independent, but the thing that I still held on to was this idea that there was deep transformational potential in the transcendent sort of approach to politics that I felt Barack Obama had modeled in the 2008 campaign, and more deeply that I very much still held to with no sense of contradiction in the nonviolent teachings of Martin Luther King Jr. I wanted to be a bridge for people in American life, black and white, left and right, to see each other. And so I made a decision to join the conversation, and the only way I could think to do that would allow me to have some visibility in it, I thought, well, you know what? I have no money, no reputation, but I think I know my stuff, and I've got a lot of energy. We were moving back to Los Angeles to start our family, and I said, let me run for Congress, just to have an opportunity to speak my mind and to try and bring some grace to what seemed to me to be a rapidly disintegrating sort of social climate in American life. And so that's what I did, and that's where my career, such as it was in Republican politics, got started. But it's also where I began sort of putting my developed sort of the substance of my perspective as it had developed into active dialogue and interaction with people from wide-ranging points of view on material questions important to their lives. And it's where I began to become tested by people who would challenge me on what I believed, where I was coming from. And it wasn't the end of a growing process and a learning process. It was the beginning. My views have changed even from then to now on many things, but that is the story of how I became more conservative in any event.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I have many questions, but let me share with you one story. So I believe we all have multiple stories and multiple identities, and sometimes we pick and choose, and I think, and not that we fabricate, but they're never quite complete. But unlike you, I grew up in a very Christian household.
Yeah.
6 of 9. My family's primarily from the South. My mother and father were sharecroppers. My father, who died recently in '99, was a very serious Christian minister. So I was going to church. I don't remember starting. I think I was born in the church. And I left the church when I was 11. And an interesting story. So the Church of Christ, they always ended the sermon with a question. And the question was always, does anyone have any questions to ask? Stand up. And it didn't occur to me until afterwards that no one had ever stood up. And I grew up in Detroit, what's called Black Bottom. But I was a ferocious reader, and I was reading about Chinese. I'd never seen an actual Chinese in Detroit. But I knew there were a lot of them. At the time, close to 1 billion. And I knew most of them had never even heard of Jesus. And the church doctrine was, unless you accepted Jesus, you're going to hell.
Right. Yeah.
So the minister was speaking. It wasn't my dad, it was Brother Manuel. And he asked the question, does anyone have any questions? And I stood up. And there was an audible gasp. And Brother Manuel was cool though. He said, that's all right, that's right. Brother Powell, what is your question? And I said, what's going to happen to the Chinese?
Mm-hmm.
And everybody in church was really confused now, like the Chinese. And he took me to different scriptures in the Bible. And the way the church operated is the minister was not supposed to just tell you, they're supposed to guide you to the truth that was in the Bible.
Right.
So he took me to different passages, and I found all of them inadequate to the question.
Right.
I never went back to church. And my family's extremely close. It created a rupture in my family. In a sense, I had grown up in a space where belonging was given, with a family where the family was so much love and so much caring. You know, I wouldn't have used those words at that time. Right. But as I look back and as I retell the story, it actually ruptured that belonging. And it took a long time to heal it. But I never went back to church. And the question, in a sense, of what happened to the Chinese stayed with me. And so in some ways, my thing of looking at people, and I would say not just people, but certainly not just Americans, but people writ large, became more and more pressing. And that extended to the earth. And I've studied different religions, both in terms of practice, but also more formally. And that question has continued, like, if everybody belongs, and at the Institute we say there's a circle of human concern where no one's outside the circle. It doesn't mean that everyone in the circle agrees with each other, but it means everyone's accorded human dignity. And I teach at Berkeley, and Berkeley tends to be left of center. And I oftentimes remind students that the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence says something to the fact of, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, but okay, all people are created equal. We hold that truth to be self-evident, which means it's not conditional. You don't have to prove it. It's just given, which is very close to some of the way that Christianity is taught.
Yeah.
But that passage, as you know, was penned by Thomas Jefferson, who had over 200 slaves. Right. So how do you hold those two things together? And to me, that's what Gunther Merida was writing about when he wrote about the American dilemma. Yeah. The dilemma of a country founded upon the notion of the self-evident equality of all people and slaves in the myth. And that contradiction to me is still tearing at the country. But it's a dilemma. Yeah. And I know we don't have much time. Time is moving pretty fast, but I think the sort of complexity of people and our ability to aspire to something great and at the same time to do something terrible and to build both institutions, but in this instance, relationships that can hold that. Right. Relationships that can hold our complexity and move us in a certain direction. To me, that's the work of bridging. And I'll just say before I turn it back to you, I hope, this has been a great conference, but I hope people will take it upon themselves to become bridgers, as many as can, to become ambassadors for belonging, not because you agree with someone, not because someone's the same political party, but because we all belong. We all belong to this little sphere called the earth. How do we actually make that real? And how do we actually learn to actually not only just see each other, but to care and love each other? So let me turn that question back to you. How do we learn, regardless to our political difference, regardless to our historical differences, and our past is replete with suffering and conquest and slavery and whatever, aspirations. How do we learn to love each other and become bridgers?
Forgive me if I if I continue to, if I go deeper in the theological direction, you probably didn't intend for me to get more theological than political, but it just seems so relevant here, in part in light of the story that you told, because I have a story that is very parallel, but coming in the opposite trajectory from the one you just sort of explained in terms of your relationship to the church early on. You know, if I were to crystallize my early opposition to Christianity on the basis of any one thing, you know, it really was the very thing you pointed to, the idea that the Chinese, you know, were condemned on the basis of not being Christian. Although in my context, it was even more salient in my thinking about my gay friends, you know, who would be damned because of their sexuality. And part of what happened is that in my sort of reading of Scripture, I came upon passages such as you find in Matthew and Mark, where Jesus says that there is only one unforgivable sin, and it is the rejection of the Holy Spirit, if you will. And in reading John, I came to the understanding that, you know, what God is spirit, and that spirit is love. I mean, God may be more than love, but God is love. That is the central sort of idea. And everybody who loves is born of God and knows God. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love. Therefore, to reject the Holy Spirit is merely to reject love in a deep and internal way. And so that's, for me, when you hear language that says that those who do not, you know, accept, you know, Christ are damned already, you have to sort of take Christ as sort of, in part at least, a stand-in for the substance of love. And why is that relevant here? Love, if you look at it, you know, in its multiple dimensions, and, you know, Paul sort of lays it out in this way, you know, there's this idea that love is long-suffering, you know, and that love is edifying. Love does not seek its own. It seeks the good of others. But love, I think, also recognizes the fact that human beings are fallen, to continue with the religious terminology. I mean, we are flawed by nature. And in addition to the fact that we are universally flawed and prone to temptation and failings, we exist in contexts that may very well bring out the worst in us in one way or the other. But that doesn't mean that we lack for higher moral potential, right? And so, you know, we can look at individuals this way, but we also to look at nations and institutions in this way too. I think what you see in the American founding is a tension that is deep, poignant, and tragic. But we can make a choice, I think, as to whether or not we see that tension as nothing more than an indictment of the soul of the founding writ large, or as a tension that has allowed for us to progressively overcome elements of that historic failing over time, to the extent to which we could come to a moment in American life where we have not realized perfect justice and perfect equality and perfect liberty in American life, but we have made it possible in coming together as Americans, as communities, in love and recognition of each other's equal dignity, and translating that to a greater approximation of equal rights, to allow for people like myself to be able to come into the world and have an upbringing that allowed me to see the best in the people around me. And that's not to say that anybody else is, you know, that we should be complacent with the fact that, you know, some of us have that opportunity and privilege and others don't. Absolutely not. But to the extent to which any of us have some privilege to say that we have benefited from American life, we ought actively sort of invest that in the greater uplift of our fellow Americans, not in response to sort of moral prodding or shaming, but out of an axiomatic desire to love and out of an axiomatic belief in the dignity of our fellow man. For me,
So
that's
John,
the power of nonviolence.
They're getting ready to stop us. So
Yeah, indeed.
time. So she said, time to wrap up.
So to crystallize it, an a priori belief in the dignity of your fellow man gives you psychological and spiritual permission to be curious about his, her, and their lived experience, so that you can absorb their story and see in its reflection your own, in precisely the way that you and I think, have done in this conversation. And if you can internalize that way of being and thinking, it will lead you through the thickets of difficult conversations in a way that will make you spiritually and socially powerful in creating connections with your neighbor and with your fellow American, regardless of where he or she may come
So
from.
we only have a minute or so left, but let me broaden and even challenge what you say. It resonates very deeply, except it's for me, too American-centric.
Mhm.
We have people from all over the world at this conference possibly listening in. Like I mentioned, my daughter was born in Tanzania. Her first language was Tamil, which is Indian. And my initial thing was looking at Chinese from the American perspective, from a Christian perspective. But having lived in some time in China, it's like even the idea of the original sin, right? That is actually a Christian approach to the origin story. It's not the Chinese approach. It's not the Buddhist approach. It's not the Hindu approach. It's not the Jain approach. So my thing is, and I think we're going to run out of time, but in terms of bridging and living in a world, it seems to me that part of the challenge is to bridge with people, not just our fellow Americans. That's a huge challenge. We're a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious country, but we're not the world. And so how do we actually expand the bridging to people who will have very different foundational beliefs and organizations and structures to support those beliefs, many of them much older than our own. So I hope we will continue this conversation, and I wish we had more time. But also want to invite you on this journey, and I hope we will probably work together, but not just for the United States, not just for Americans. You know, there are 360 million Americans, there's 8 billion people, many of whom still have not heard of Jesus or Christianity. And I'll end by just saying this. I was talking to one of the graduate students who got a PhD in philosophy, and I minored in philosophy. So we're talking about Schopenhauer and Wittgenstein and Kant, and he was going on and on. He said, I studied world philosophy. And I said, so what did you study about Confucianism? He said, nothing. I said, 60% of the world's grounding, foundational grounding, is based on Confucius. How could you say you're studying world religion from one of the best universities in the world and know nothing about Confucius? So I think we have to broaden our conversation to include the whole world and the world, not just all the people, but the world itself.
Right. The beloved community is a global project.
That's right.
Ultimately.
That's right.
And with that, I agree.
That's right. And you know, King got in trouble for reaching out to Thich Nhat Hanh.
He did. That's right. That's right. He started to go international, and suddenly, you know, he encountered a whole new world of problems.
And we talked, and I know our time is up, but we just talked about a great American hero who's also a Republican, whom I had a chance to meet years ago, Colin Powell.
Yeah.
And again, just the breadth of his life, I think, regardless if you're a Republican or Democrat, liberal or conservative. And he made mistakes. And one of the things I love about Colin Powell is he admitted that he made mistakes. And I think having humility to admit and the curiosity to continue to grow, I think that's one of the ways in which we bridge, but also at the heart.
Yeah, I'm in total agreement with you. And hopefully we've modeled that conversation from that heart-centered space. It is a heartfelt joy in any event to be in dialogue with you, John.
And it's just starting.
Pleasure. And it's just starting. Thank you, sir.
Yes, I just want to thank you both so much for such a powerful conversation that we all got to witness. I think one of the most incredible things is how human this conversation was, and really what that brings forward for us, even as we start to grapple with some really complex issues of relationships and bridging and all of that. To be able to do so in such a human way is incredibly powerful for all of us. So let's take a short break, and then John Powell and I will come back and we will just sort of reflect on some themes and then be able to take Q&A from you all.